Hey everyone, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. My name is Beth Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I'm also a mom of two young boys. I have a 4.5-year-old and also an 18-month-old. In today's teacher tip video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I balance mom life and teaching life. Now, before we get started, I don't want to claim that I have all the answers to either teaching or to being a mom. But over the course of the past 5 years, I've learned a few different things that have helped me streamline my grading process and making the teaching side of my life easier. That way, I can spend more time at home with my boys. So, first of all, let's talk about the word balance because sometimes when I think of balance, I think of a scale where everything is evenly weighted, nothing's tipping it one side to the other, and sometimes that's not realistic. For instance, there are plenty of times during the school year when my life feels out of balance. Maybe I have several essays to grade, or maybe I have a pile of laundry that has to be done. So sometimes it's more like juggling. I'm not sure where I heard it, but I once heard this metaphor basically comparing being a mom to being a juggler. In life, we have certain tasks or responsibilities that are made of glass. We don't want to drop them because they'll break. But there's other tasks that might be made of plastic. So we don't necessarily want to drop them, but if we do, then they might make a loud noise, they might dent, but they're not going to break. And I think this can be a helpful comparison because sometimes we have to figure out what is the highest priority. So it's important to remember that sometimes as we're juggling teaching life and mom life, we might drop the ball once in a while, but we want to make sure that we've prioritized the right things. And so if you do find yourself behind on your grading or maybe behind on your laundry or your dishes or whatever it is, give yourself a little bit of grace. It's also important to remember that it's okay to say no. This was hard for me to learn at the beginning of my teaching career because, quite frankly, I feel like a lot of teachers are yes people. We are people pleasers. We want to help others, but we also have to recognize that as teachers, we're asked to do a lot beyond our regular classroom responsibilities. This could be sponsoring a club, coaching a team, taking on an event at school. And if you add in family responsibilities on top of all that, it can be really overwhelming. So just remember, it's okay to say no. And this could be saying no to something at school, or it could be saying no to something outside of school. At the start of last year, I made it my goal to leave school at school as much as possible. Now, initially, this was a lot easier said than done because I was so used to taking my work home with me. But I realized that I wasn't really being paid to do that, if you want to get technical. Like, I have contract hours, I'm on a salary, but I was staying up late grading papers, making lesson plans, doing all the teacher things. And I realized that I didn't really have to do it that way because sometimes the deadlines I was putting on myself were just that. They were self imposed deadlines. Did it really matter if I handed the essays back the next day, or could it wait a day or two? So, right now, I try to make sure that I work within my contract hours. So, I get to school a little bit early. I set up for my day. If there's time, I might grade things or make copies. I definitely try to make use of my planning period. And then I stay after school until I'm supposed to. And then I'm mom, I'm no longer teacher. This also applies to checking emails at home. I have my email set up on my phone and I refresh it at different times throughout the night. And so I had to remind myself that I do not owe people an immediate answer, whether it's a student, an administrator, a parent. 24 hours is plenty of time to get back to somebody. It does not have to be instant because when you stop what you're doing, whether it's playing with your kids or cooking dinner or just enjoying a TV show that you want to watch, and you stop that to answer an email, then you're disrupting the flow of your personal time or your family time. So, yes, there have been a few times where something did require my immediate attention, but overall, I've had to learn to put it off and respond later. Now, sometimes I worry that I'm going to forget to respond because if I've read the email, then I might not respond to it. So I either set a reminder in my phone to respond to it or I make sure that I change it back to unread. I've already mentioned this, but it can be really helpful to utilize your planning period and your other contract hours for things like making copies, grading, things like that. In this video, I'm going to give you some tips to streamline the grading process as well. As an AP Lang teacher, there are times during the year when my students spend an entire class period. Our classes are 45 minutes long, writing an essay. And so it kind of seems counterproductive, but when they're writing an essay, I make sure to catch up on my grading. The same thing applies for when I have them do multiple choice practice. Sometimes I have them do just a passage, so I might time them for 10 minutes. Sometimes I give them a full multiple choice test or at least a couple passages at a time. And so, therefore, when they're working on that, I'm getting tasks done that I need to get done. That way, I can be using my time effectively. It's also important to consider what type of grader you are. I personally like to do something called a grading burst versus a grading marathon. And what I mean by that is I like to grade in, let's say, 25-minute intervals. A few years ago, I was introduced to the Pomodoro method, which basically says that you do a task for 25 minutes and then you have 5 minutes off. This is really helpful for my personality type because I'm able to choose an assignment, maybe a short assignment that I could grade a whole class worth in 25 minutes. And then I feel like I've really accomplished something. Or if it's a longer assignment, maybe in 25 minutes, I can grade 5 or 6 essays. But that way, I'm giving those 5 or 6 essays my undivided attention for that 25 minutes. Conversely, if I were to sit there and grade for a couple hours straight, I think I would get tired and maybe that would impact how I'm viewing the papers that I'm reading. So I like to take quick breaks in between and set up shorter time intervals for myself. But if you're the type of person that prefers a grading marathon, then go for it. Basically, the point is figure out which method works best for you. So now let's talk about some ways to streamline the grading process because as English teachers, we tend to have a lot to grade, and some of these things that we have to grade take us a while. So how can we make this easier on ourselves? First of all, we got to realize that we don't have to grade everything. I think a lot of times our students might expect us to grade everything. You know, you've been asked before, is this for a grade? And if you say no, chances are the students aren't going to want to do the work. And who can really blame them? But here's the thing, you don't necessarily need to grade everything. Sometimes there are preliminary assignments that build to a larger assignment. Another way to streamline your grading is to offer completion grades. So, when I say completion grade, what I mean is that if the student does the work, they get a grade for it. Completion grades can be really helpful if you're feeling overwhelmed. Usually, I do it for smaller point value assignments. So, things like bell work or maybe having them write a thesis and topic sentences. These are easy things to make a completion grade, and that'll help you get the grades entered more quickly. You also want to consider assigning shorter assignments. This is great for preventing burnout from you, the teacher, and also your students. When I started teaching, I assigned a lot of essays. And yes, my students improved as writers, but I think over time I realized we don't have to go straight to the essay because what I was doing is I was putting the same comments on each paragraph. So from one student's paper to the next, I was making the same comments. And instead of having to write the same comments over and over again, I realized it was better if we just took a step backward and focused on writing a strong intro or strong body paragraphs. Those are a lot easier to provide more detailed feedback on if needed. And if you assign a body paragraph and give feedback and then assign another body paragraph for a different prompt later on, students can apply that feedback. And as they get comfortable with body paragraphs, then they can build to the essay. So here are some examples of shorter assignments. One thing that I like to do to teach thesis statements is something called Is It Defensible? Basically, what you do is you give your students thesis statements and they have to decide, is it defensible, yes or no, and why? If you want more information about this, I'll leave it linked in the description box below. I have some examples and templates for you that you can use in your classroom. Something else that I do with Is It Defensible is I extend the assignment and I have students write a thesis statement of their own. You can also just have them write a thesis statement of their own for bell work. Sometimes I will time my students and have them write an introduction, and I'll only give them about 5 minutes because that's really how long they need. I want to give them a little bit of practice for timed essays. Something else you can do is have your students write a thesis and topic sentences to help them start to understand the concept of line of reasoning. These are also really easy to grade, and you can give them sentence frames. I have several of those linked in different videos. I'll include a link to my sentence frames in the description box below as well. Besides the timed intro, you can do timed body paragraphs or untimed body paragraphs. Usually when I'm starting the timing process, I give students about 20 to 25 minutes for a body paragraph. And then as time goes on, we scale it down to maybe 17 to 20 minutes, depending on the expectations and the type of essay, things like that. Those timed body paragraphs are really helpful because it allows students to practice for the exam. But also, if you time students, then they're less likely to be distracted. I found that if I give my students like a whole class period to write a paragraph, then they chit chat and things like that. So, setting time constraints helps your students focus more as well. It's also really helpful to look at student samples. The College Board has provided several, and I think when students look at student samples before they write an essay, it helps them know the expectations. This often leads to higher quality writing, and that way it's a little bit easier for you to grade as well. As your students get comfortable with expectations, you can also turn over the editing process to them and let them peer edit before you actually score. That way, there's less for you to comment on as well. And when students are providing the feedback, it helps them understand the expectations. They get to learn from each other. So, this is something that I do every once in a while in my classroom. And then the last thing that I want you to consider is quick writes. I have students do this as an out of class assignment. I personally try to give a lot of student choice. So they choose a TED Talk, a podcast, or maybe a documentary of their choice, and then they write a paragraph about it. I'll link my quick writes slides in the description box below. That way you can use them if you want to. But basically, I keep it pretty open-ended most of the time, and I let them choose what they want to write about, because if students are interested in it, then they're more invested. Also, sometimes I'll have students do a quick write for something that we're doing in class. So for instance, when my students read Queen Liliuokalani's letter to President McKinley, then I have them listen to a podcast before they read the letter, because that podcast is great for understanding the historical context. And quite frankly, the people who make the podcast explain the whole situation better than I could. So it's a way for my students to hear it from somebody else. I have them then write a paragraph response to the podcast. And that's a pretty easy grade for me, because usually my quick writes are some form of a completion grade. Something that I didn't include on this slide, but is an easy thing to grade as well, would be outlines. It falls under thesis and topic sentences. It's just more involved because they're coming up with their evidence and commentary as well. Outlines can be pretty thorough if you want them to be, so make sure your expectations are clear, but it's a great way for students to demonstrate their understanding of a prompt without actually having them write the essay, so you can then score the outline. Or you can have them use the outline so that they can write a stronger essay. Sometimes, especially when my students are just beginning a certain type of essay, like usually with my 10th graders, I will have them write the outline and then I let them use the outline when they actually write the essay. You should also consider using rubrics, because this can streamline your grading process as well. So I use the AP Lang rubrics for essays, but also for certain assignments that I know I'm going to be giving multiple times throughout the year, I create a rubric. It is a little bit frustrating to do it up front, but if you get to reuse that rubric multiple times throughout the year or from year to year, it makes it a lot easier. It also helps make sure that you're grading consistently, and it lets students know the expectations. So rubrics can help make grading a little bit easier. Now let's talk about student feedback, because when students are writing, we want to make sure that we're giving them quality feedback. I remember being in high school and all of us got hundreds on an essay that we had, and we all got a good job at the top. And I felt really let down because I had worked so hard on that essay. And I felt like I needed to know what exactly I did well. And if everybody got 100, like, where did my essay really stand? Like, what did I actually do well? And so then when I went to college and I was an English major, our professors would actually write like a full paragraph at the end of each of our papers that we turned in, letting us know what they liked and things like that. Now, I think most college professors have fewer students, at least in the classes that I was taking. They had fewer students than what I have as a high school English teacher. So I don't write a paragraph every time. But what I try to do is offer what I call glow and grow feedback. So basically, the idea is that I give my students 1 or 2 glows, so I praise them, and then 1 or 2 grows, which would be constructive criticism, things to work on in the future. This allows me to tailor my feedback to the individual student and their individual assignment, but also it means that I don't have to write a lot of feedback on their paper. It's also important to remember that you don't have to be your student's editor. I did this a lot as a beginning English teacher. I would comment on everything. I would correct the spelling mistakes, the comma splices, and I realized that my students really didn't pay attention to those comments anyway. So I'm not saying that those things aren't important, but I realized that I needed to select a very specific focus when I was grading. This really streamlined my process. So for instance, If we were focusing on embedding evidence in class, then that was what I focused on. If we were talking about developing commentary, then that's what I focused on. Now, sometimes, yes, I focus on multiple topics, but if you're really feeling stressed out about your grading and you feel very overwhelmed, don't try to comment on everything. Pick one or two focus areas, things that you've been talking about in class, and just give your students feedback based on those particular focuses. There are a lot of Facebook communities out there for secondary teachers. There are some great ones for AP Lang. If you are an AP Lang teacher, I encourage you to check out the English Coaching Garden. This is a Facebook group that I started with Tim Freitas from the Garden of English. So we'd love to have you in there as well. But I notice sometimes that on these Facebook groups, there's a lot of, I guess, pressure to kind of do what everybody else is doing. There's a lot of opportunity for comparison, and sometimes that can be detrimental. So you don't need to do every single assignment that somebody recommends. As someone who creates tutorial videos, I so appreciate the people who watch my videos and have their students watch my videos, but it could be really overwhelming. It could be overwhelming to watch videos. It could be overwhelming to try all these different assignments. So keep it simple. You don't have to do all the things. Honestly, in a lot of cases, less is more. That's one of the things that I've learned the more I've taught is scale back and focus on the fundamentals. Don't necessarily try to go over the top with everything. So choose one project that you want to do well. You don't have to like decorate your classroom every time, or choose one project that you think your students will really like. You don't have to have them do all the projects. So keep it simple. Don't try to do all the things. Also, remember that it doesn't have to be fancy. Done is better than perfect. Now, I try to create teaching resources that are nicer quality, but there are times when I just give my kids a Google Doc and it is totally fine. They still learn what they're supposed to learn. So it doesn't have to be fancy. If you want to make fancier slides, I recommend SlidesGo or Canva. They have some nice templates, but it's okay to keep it simple. As long as your students are learning, it doesn't matter how fancy it is. Sometimes I have had assignments that have gone over super well, but it was literally a Google Doc. Now, I know I said don't try to do all the things, but there are situations where you probably don't want to reinvent the wheel. So, in these cases, don't reinvent the wheel unless you want to or have to. You can use resources that are already created and teacher tested and student approved. If you're looking for some resources, I have a rhetorical analysis unit and also an argument unit that I'll link in the description box below. They're available in my TPT store. I have lots of resources there that will help with AP Lang and even grammar instruction if you're interested. One thing to consider is staggering assignments. I try to do this by not assigning essays in all my classes at the same time because I teach 4 different classes. So if my AP Lang students are doing an essay, then I know not to assign an essay in college English. That way I can finish grading one large assignment before moving on to the next. Now, if you teach one class the whole day, this might not be as possible, but something that you can consider is having your students write 2 timed essays. I do this in AP Lang as it gets closer to the exam. And so they write one week and they write one the next week. And then after they've written both, they tell me which one they want me to score. So I will score one and they peer edit the other. That way they're still getting feedback, but I'm not having to score all the essays. You also want to remember to teach text that you enjoy, because if you're not passionate about it, it's hard for the students to be interested in it. So if you are able to choose what you want to include in your curriculum, choose pieces that you like, that you're excited about teaching, because that makes the process more enjoyable. Now let's talk really quickly about grammar instruction, because this is another important component of secondary English. I recommend No Red Ink because it's free. Now, it's not perfect. There are questions on there where I'm like, that's not how I would want it to be phrased. But overall, my students enjoy it, and it's a way for me to give a completion grade. They also have diagnostics, practice, growth quizzes, and I don't assign it every week by any means, but as we're preparing for our standardized testing, my students have enjoyed it. It's a great way to kind of supplement the grammar instruction we're already doing. We also pay for IXL in our district. I prefer IXL compared to No Red Ink, but my students like No Red Ink better just because of how IXL does their point values. But again, this could be a way to supplement your grammar instruction. I also have created some self-checking resources and other grammar resources to supplement what we're doing in class. When I introduce grammar, I try to introduce one skill at a time. So we have a skill of the week for the first several weeks of school. And then as time goes on, then I'm able to have students actually incorporate these grammar skills into their writing as well. So it's not just multiple choice practice, but it's also practical writing instruction. Sometimes I'll do a question of the day. So I'll take an ACT or AP Lang question and I'll have that be a Google question. If I want to ask multiple questions, I might do a Google form. And again, quick and easy grades, but it's a way for me to make sure that my students are understanding and retaining that grammar instruction. Sometimes during the year, I'll do multiple choice Monday, and then other times I'll do a passage of the day just to kind of vary things up. I like doing a passage of the day because we time the students for however long they need, and then we go over the answers. So this takes about half a class, and then I have the second half of class to do what else I want to do. But you can also have students work together to rationalize the correct answer. You can have students learn from each other. There's so many different ways to make multiple choice Monday or a passage of the day work for you. And it's a great way to make sure that students are being exposed to those grammar skills that you wanted. You could also do it with reading too. And for those, I usually give a completion grade because I don't want students to be so focused on their score. So if a student makes like a 10 out of 15, they're not going to want that going in the grade book and they might be inclined to cheat. So what I do is I just give everybody a completion grade for stuff like that. It tends to help them not be as stressed, and that way I get accurate data. You can also add grammar requirements to your assignments. I like to include this in the instructions, like make sure that in your paragraph you include an example of a colon or dashes. If you add it to the assignment requirements, students are more inclined to follow that. And over time, they start to do it on their own, and it makes their writing a lot nicer. All right, there you have it. Those are some of my top tips for balancing mom life and teaching as a secondary English teacher. Please don't forget to check out the description box below. There you'll find a link to my email list so you can get tips and tricks sent straight to your inbox. And also all the resources I mentioned in this video will be linked there as well. Until next time, happy teaching.